When we think of Beauty and the Beast, Gaston is often cast as the villain, a vain, arrogant brute who tries to force Belle into marriage and ultimately leads a mob to unalive the Beast. But what if Gaston wasn't the bad guy? What if he was just a rational man reacting to a bizarre and unsettling situation? Let's take a closer look at Gaston's actions and see if we can't reframe him as the misunderstood hero of the story. Let's start with the basics. Gaston lived in a small, provincial town where everyone adored him. He was the local hero, strong, handsome, and confident. In a world where men were expected to be providers and protectors, Gaston excelled. He was the town's golden boy and everyone except Belle loved him. Can we really blame him for having a healthy ego? He was just living up to the expectations of his community. When Gaston pursued Belle, he wasn't being malicious. He genuinely believed they were a perfect match. In his mind, he was the best catch in town and Belle was the most beautiful woman. So why wouldn't they end up together? His proposal might have been clumsy and self-centered, and tried to impose the role of the traditional woman on Belle by speaking of his dream of her being a meek homemaker and the mother of his sons, but it wasn't evil, it was just tone-deaf. And let's be honest, who hasn't misread a situation or two in their love life? Now let's talk about the Beast. From Gaston's perspective, Belle was kidnapped by a monstrous creature and held captive in a creepy, enchanted castle. What was Gaston supposed to do? Sit back and let Belle live in danger? Of course not. He rallied the townsfolk to rescue her, which is exactly what any good leader or love interest would do. Sure, the Beast turned out to be a misunderstood prince, but Gaston didn't have that information. All he saw was a terrifying beast who had taken the woman he wanted. His decision to storm the castle wasn't villainous, it was actually really heroic. He was trying to save the village and by extension Belle from what he believed was a dangerous beast. One of Gaston's most admirable traits was his decisiveness. While other characters hemmed and hawed, Gaston took action. When he wanted something, he went for it. Whether it was winning a hunting competition, organizing a mob, or wooing Belle, Gaston didn't sit around waiting for things to happen. He made them happen. In a way, Gaston was the antithesis of the Beast. The Beast was passive. He just sat around for years and waited for someone to break his curse. Gaston, on the other hand, was proactive. He saw a problem and tackled it head-on. Isn't that the kind of person most people would want as a life partner or want in a crisis? Gaston's biggest mistake wasn't his actions, it was his lack of knowledge. He didn't know about the curse, the enchanted objects, or the Beast's true nature. If he had known the full story, he might have acted differently. But with the information he had, his actions made sense. Imagine if Gaston had been given the chance to understand the Beast's situation. Maybe he could have been an ally instead of an adversary. Unfortunately, he was never given that opportunity. Instead, he was left in the dark, forced to make decisions based on incomplete information. Now one could argue that Belle did try to tell Gaston about the Beast's true nature, but let's look at the situation rationally here. And to do that we have to look at what happened to Maurice and Belle. Maurice returned to the village with an outlandish story about a monstrous beast living in a cursed castle. To the townsfolk, this sounded like the ramblings of a madman. After all, beasts and enchanted castles don't exactly fit into the rational, everyday world they knew. Gaston, as a respected figure in the community, gave Maurice a chance to prove his story and asked him to lead the way to this alleged beast and mysterious castle, something none of the villagers even bothered to do. Gaston only ended up losing his temper with Maurice only after he failed to lead him to the castle and substantiate his claims and sanity. Gaston is often criticized for deciding to put Maurice in a mental asylum, but after he failed to prove his outlandish tale, it was only logical that he be put away in the care of that time period's version of mental health care professionals. If Maurice's claims were left unchecked, they could have caused panic or inspired others to go searching for this supposed beast, putting themselves in harm's way. Sending Maurice to the asylum wasn't cruel, it was a precautionary measure to ensure the safety and stability of the village. Belle, meanwhile, showed up later and not only believed her father's story but also claimed to have seen the beast herself. From Gaston's perspective, this was deeply concerning. Belle was a bright, intelligent woman, and her sudden insistence on the existence of a beast suggested that she might be suffering from some kind of mental breakdown, perhaps brought on by the stress of her father's disappearance or her own isolation from the community. Gaston cared for Belle and didn't want to see her spiral into delusion. By suggesting she needed help, he was acting out of genuine concern. In his mind, the asylum wasn't a punishment. It was a place where Belle and Maurice could receive the care they needed to recover from their shared delusion. Even if Gaston had entertained the idea that the beast might be real, his actions still make sense. If a dangerous creature was lurking in the woods, the last thing the town needed was for Maurice and Belle to spread fear and confusion. By removing them from the equation, Gaston was trying to prevent a potential panic. Moreover, if the beast was real, sending Maurice and Belle to the asylum would have kept them safe. Gaston could then focus on organizing a proper hunt to eliminate the threat without worrying about their interference or safety. In this light, his decision was both pragmatic and protective. As the town's hero, Gaston had a duty to protect his people. If Maurice and Belle's claims were allowed to spread unchecked, it could have led to widespread fear, chaos, or even harm. Gaston's actions were necessary in order to maintain order and ensure the well-being of the community as a whole. While it's easy to see his plan as harsh, it's important to remember that Gaston was operating in a time when mental health was poorly understood. Asylums were seen as places of treatment, not punishment. He was trying to protect the people and the community he cherished. Isn't that what a hero is supposed to do? And speaking of asylums and mental health, one of the most enduring critiques of Beauty and the Beast is the argument that Belle's relationship with the Beast is a classic example of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where a captive develops feelings of affection or loyalty toward their captor. If we apply modern standards to the story, Gaston's reluctance to accept Belle's love for the Beast becomes not only understandable but downright justified. Let's just take a brief moment to break this point down. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response where a hostage or abuse victim develops positive feelings toward their captor or abuser as a survival mechanism. This often occurs in situations where the victim is isolated, dependent on their captor, and subjected to a mix of threats and kindness. In Beauty and the Beast, Belle is literally taken prisoner by the Beast. He locks her in a castle, yells at her, and initially treats her with hostility. Over time, however, he begins to show her kindness, and Belle starts to see him in a new light. While the story frames this as a romantic transformation, modern audiences might view it as a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome. Belle's situation in the Beast's castle fits the criteria for Stockholm Syndrome to a T. She is isolated from her family and community, cut off from any outside support. Her only interactions are with the Beast and the enchanted objects, who are all invested in breaking the curse. This creates an environment where Belle is emotionally and psychologically dependent on the Beast. Using the magic mirror, Belle is able to prove that she and her father aren't delusional by proving the existence of the Beast, but that does not mean that she still didn't deserve to be institutionalized, and that was because she showed Gaston and the townfolk that she loved the Beast. From Gaston's perspective, Belle's sudden affection for the Beast would have been deeply alarming. He knew Belle as an independent, strong-willed woman who valued her freedom. To see her defending and even falling in love with her captor would have seemed completely out of character, and frankly like a red flag for coercion or manipulation. If we apply modern standards to Gaston's actions, his concern for Belle becomes even more valid. Today, we understand the dynamics of abusive relationships and the psychological effects of captivity. Gaston, as an outsider looking in, would have seen Belle's behavior as a clear sign that something was wrong. When Belle returned to the village and defended the Beast, Gaston had every reason to be skeptical. From his perspective, Belle was rationalizing her captor's behavior and making excuses for him, a common trait in victims of Stockholm Syndrome. Gaston's refusal to accept Belle's feelings for the Beast wasn't just jealousy alone, it was also a legitimate concern for her well-being. Gaston's plan to storm the castle and kill the Beast can be seen as an attempt to rescue Belle from what he perceived as an abusive situation. While his methods were extreme, his intentions were rooted in a desire to protect her. In his mind, Belle was under the beast's spell, whether literal or psychological, and needed to be freed. Even his decision to rally the townsfolk makes sense in this context. If Belle was truly in danger, it was Gaston's duty as the town's hero to intervene. His actions were driven by a belief that Belle was being manipulated and that the beast posed a threat not only to her but to the entire community that was justifiably terrified. The irony of Gaston's character is that he is vilified for trying to do what modern audiences might consider the right thing. While the story frames him as the antagonist, his actions align with what we now understand about abusive relationships and the psychological effects of captivity. In that light, we could rightly say that Gaston was ahead of his time in his understanding of Belle's compromised mental state, even though he used politically incorrect verbiage. Gaston's downfall is that he lacks the full context of the story. He doesn't know about the curse or the beast's potential for redemption. All he sees is a woman he cares about defending her captor, a situation that, by modern standards, would raise serious concerns. When viewed through a modern lens, Gaston's actions take on a new meaning. His refusal to accept Belle's love for the beast was a rational response to a deeply troubling situation. In a world where we understand the dangers of Stockholm Syndrome and abusive relationships, Gaston's concerns are not only valid but commendable. So the next time you watch Beauty and the Beast, consider this: Gaston wasn't the villain. He was a man trying to protect someone he cared about from what he saw as a dangerous and unhealthy relationship. And in doing so, he might have been more of a hero than we ever gave him credit for. Before we finish this video, we have seriously got to talk about the double standard of Belle's heart and why Gaston deserved a chance. One of the most puzzling aspects of Beauty and the Beast is Belle's unwavering ability to see the good in the beast while dismissing Gaston entirely. Sure, Gaston wasn't perfect, but compared to the beast, a literal kidnapper with a temper, his flaws seem almost trivial. So why did Belle give the beast a chance, but never extended the same courtesy to Gaston? Let's explore this double standard and why Gaston might have deserved a fair shot. Number 1. The Beast's redemption arc versus Gaston's first impressions. The Beast's story is one of redemption. He starts as a selfish, angry prince cursed for his arrogance, but through Belle's influence, he learns to love and be loved. Belle sees the potential for good in him and helps him change. But what about Gaston? From the moment we meet him, he's portrayed as arrogant and self-absorbed, but his flaws are relatively mild compared to the Beast's initial behavior. Let's not forget, Gaston was not the one who got cursed for being a terrible human being, the Beast did. Gaston never locked Belle in a dungeon or yelled at her in a fit of rage. Yet, Belle never gives him the opportunity to grow or change. She dismisses him outright, labeling him as a boorish brute without ever considering that he too might have the capacity for growth. Number 2. Gaston's flaws: vanity and overconfidence. Let's be honest, Gaston's worst qualities are his vanity and overconfidence. He's a man who's been told he's perfect his entire life, so it's no wonder he's a little full of himself. But are these flaws really so terrible? Compared to the Beast's initial cruelty, Gaston's arrogance seems almost endearing. He's not malicious, he's just oblivious. And while his pursuit of Belle is clumsy and self-centered, it's not inherently evil. In fact, Gaston's persistence could be seen as a sign of his genuine interest in Belle, and his wish to marry her instead of just trifling with her is what would have been considered honorable gentlemanly behavior from a respectable suitor. He just went about it the wrong way, something that could have been corrected with a little guidance. Number 3. Belle's bias against Gaston. Belle's rejection of Gaston seems to stem more from her disdain for the townsfolk's shallow values than from Gaston himself. She sees him as a symbol of everything she hates about her provincial life: conformity, narrow-mindedness, and a lack of ambition. But is this fair? Gaston may embody some of these traits, but he's also a product of his environment. Just as Belle sees the potential for good in the Beast, she could have tried to see the potential for growth in Gaston. Instead, she writes him off completely, refusing to give him the same chance she gives the Beast. Number 4. The Beast's red flags versus Gaston's missteps. Let's compare the two men's actions. The Beast kidnaps Belle, yells at her, destroys her belongings, and initially treats her as a prisoner. Gaston proposes to Belle in a pushy, tone-deaf way and later tries to send Maurice to the asylum, which, as we've established, was a rational decision given the circumstances. By any objective standard, the Beast's behavior is far more concerning. Yet, Belle forgives him and helps him change. Gaston, on the other hand, is never given the opportunity to redeem himself. His mistakes are treated as unforgivable, while the Beasts are brushed aside as part of his journey. Number 5. What if Belle had given Gaston a chance? Imagine an alternate version of the story where Belle decides to give Gaston a chance. She challenges his worldview, introduces him to books, and encourages him to be more than just the town's hero and hunter. Could Gaston have grown into a better person under her influence? It's entirely possible. Gaston's arrogance and overconfidence are flaws, but they're not insurmountable. With the right guidance, he could have learned to be more humble, more considerate, and more open-minded. In fact, Gaston's determination and confidence could have been assets if channeled in the right direction. Belle's ability to see the good in the Beast while dismissing Gaston entirely is a double standard that deserves scrutiny. While the Beast's redemption arc is heartwarming, it's hard not to feel that Gaston was unfairly judged. His flaws were far less severe, and with a little patience and understanding, he might have had his own redemption story. But unfortunately for Gaston, his tragic flaw was overconfidence. He believed he was invincible, and that ultimately led to his downfall. But let's not confuse confidence with malice. Gaston wasn't evil. He was just too sure of himself, and it ended up costing him his life. His tragic flaw was his inability to see beyond his own perspective, which is a relatable human failing. Perhaps it's time we give Gaston a little more credit. He wasn't the bad guy. He was just a guy trying to do what he thought was right. And in a world full of curses, enchanted castles, and talking teapots, isn't that all any of us can do? So next time you watch Beauty and the Beast, try seeing Gaston in a new light. He might not be the hero we wanted, but he's certainly the hero his town thought they needed. And who knows? With a little more information and a lot less ego, he might have even been the hero Belle deserved. Okay, here are my final thoughts on Gaston. I personally think that with his rugged charm and confident demeanor, he might have found a more successful match with a Disney princess like Snow White, whose gentle and nurturing nature complements his bold personality. Snow White could have been the traditional mother and wife Gaston craved. What with her love of cooking, baking, and doing house chores, they would have been a match made in Disney heaven. Snow White's kindness and ability to see the good in others could have softened Gaston's arrogance, while his strength and determination would align with her need for protection in the forest. Unlike Belle, who values intellect and independence, Snow White's traditional and compassionate outlook might have resonated more with Gaston's old-fashioned ideals, creating a partnership rooted in mutual admiration and shared values. Funny enough, I found a fanfic that explores the unlikely pairing of Gaston and Snow White. In the fanfic, Gaston didn't die at the end of the movie but just got seriously injured. Months later, he is healed by still smarting from losing Belle. As he is out in the forest hunting, he comes across the scene where Snow White is almost unalived in cold blood and rescues her. Snow White is grateful and admires Gaston, whose ego is stroked, and he notes that Snow White is even prettier than Belle. He starts to woo the more domestically inclined Snow White, and their story comes off as actually pretty plausible. The story is well written for a fanfic, and I definitely recommend people check it out. The name of the fanfic is The Fairest of Them All, Who's As Beautiful as Me by Trudy Rose. I'm gonna leave the link in the description below for those interested in reading it for free. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss videos like this one.